I watched the dune move against the wind, its crest folding inward like a great beast drawing breath. The camels had gone to their knees without command, trembling, foam on their lips. The night air, which had been oven hot, pressed suddenly cold against my teeth. From the hollow at the dune's base, there rose a sound like many voices whispering the same word. The sand itself leaned nearer. Men have asked me to recount this, though I am no longer certain it is a kindness to do so. If you would hear such accounts again, lend your approval, mark your interest, and set down in writing below what you yourself have seen or heard in lonely places. I will answer while I am able. To understand what we encountered, I must return to the year 1910 and to Berbera on the Gulf of Aden. I had gone out under the auspices of the Royal Geographical Society with a modest grant and a letter of introduction from a colonel who had never in his life left England. My charge was to survey a caravan route inland toward the Howd Plateau and to make certain observations on seasonal wells that might be of use to the Protectorate authorities. It was, on paper, a routine journey. Heat, dust, tedious measurements, and the usual haggling with local headmen. From the beginning, there was nothing in our equipment or company that suggested strangeness. I had my Brunton compass, a prismatic surveyor's compass, a plane table, and a box sextant, along with my journals, field glasses, and a 303 Lee Enfield rifle, which I carried more from habit than need. We engaged 6 Somali camel drivers in Berbera, men seasoned to the desert. Old Yusuf with his white beard and clouded left eye, keen, wiry Ismail, broad-shouldered Farah, who sang to the camels, and 3 younger men, among them a quiet fellow named Hersey, who spoke some English. My assistant from the society, Henderson, a taciturn Scotsman with a talent for figures, completed our small party. We set out on the 17th of October, when the worst of the heat was said to be past. The sky was a hard, polished blue, without a cloud. We had 8 baggage camels and 2 for riding, loaded with water in goatskins, sacks of dates, rice, some tinned meat, canvas, a small tent for Henderson and myself, and the instruments in padded cases. The camel bells clicked and chimed as we left the outskirts of Berbera and entered the undulating plain of gravel and scrub. The first days passed in the usual fashion. We rose before dawn, broke our scant camp by lantern light while the air was still cool enough to breathe without pain, and moved until the sun grew intolerable. Then we rested the beasts in what shade we could find, beneath acacia or thorn, and went on again toward evening. I took bearings at each halt, measured distances by the camel's pace and the swing of my watch, and sketched the low hills and wadis in my notebook. At night, we lay under a sky so thick with stars that the constellations I knew were drowned in a milky sea of lesser lights. On the 4th day inland, the first small anomaly presented itself, so slight that I did not trouble to note it at the time. We had camped near a shallow depression where, in the rains, a pool sometimes formed. Now it was dry, a saucer of fine, pale sand. The wind came steadily from the northeast, combing the scrub and carrying the usual hiss of moving grains. Yet when I walked to the edge of the depression in the last light, I observed that the sand there was not shaped as one would expect. Instead of the usual ripples aligned with the wind, the surface bore a series of narrow, parallel ridges that ran in a curve, almost a crescent, their orientation quite at odds with the breeze. They were too regular for mere chance, and too slight to be the work of men. I knelt, let the sand run through my fingers, and felt nothing but the familiar dryness and warmth. When I stood, the wind erased my footprints within moments, yet those little ridges remained undisturbed. I pointed it out to Henderson, more from idle interest than concern. "The wind eddies in these hollows," he said, squinting. "You see the same in snowdrifts in the highlands. Some trick of the contour." It seemed reasonable, and I accepted it. Had I understood then that it was our first warning, I might have turned the whole caravan about and borne the scorn of the society with gratitude. That night, as we lay by the embers of the fire, I shared tobacco with Farah and asked him of his home. He spoke of a village near Hargeisa, of a wife with eyes like the dark water of a well, of 2 sons who raced goats across the stony fields. His voice softened when he described them. "And you, Sahib?" he asked, passing the pipe back. "You have a wife in your country." I told him of London's grey streets, of my small rooms near Bloomsbury, of a sister who kept house for me after our parents died. I confessed, somewhat to my own surprise, that I had once been engaged to a girl in Sussex, and that she had broken it off, unwilling to wait through another expedition. Farah listened gravely, then laughed softly. "The desert is a jealous wife," he said. "She does not like to share her men." The others chuckled at this, and even Henderson smiled in the firelight. It is a small thing, that moment, but I find it returns to me often. It made them more than mere names on a payroll. It bound us, if only lightly, before the desert began to unmake us. We pressed on. The terrain rose, the scrub thinned, and the earth grew paler, until by the 7th day we were upon the fringe of the Haud proper, a vast, undulating expanse of red and white sands, with only scattered thorn trees to break the horizon. The air took on a peculiar dryness, as if all moisture had been wrung from it. Our lips cracked, and the camel's breath came harsh and labored. It was there that the sounds began. At first, it was only an odd carrying of the wind. One afternoon, as we crossed a particularly bare stretch, I heard what I took to be the cry of a child far off to our right. It was a thin, piping sound, very brief. I turned, shading my eyes, but saw nothing save the shimmering distance. "Did you hear that?" I asked Henderson. "Hear what?" "A cry, like a child." He shook his head. "You are hearing goats from some settlement. Sound travels oddly here." I accepted this, though I could see no sign of habitation. Later that same day, as the sun sank and the wind dropped, the desert fell into an almost oppressive silence. One grows accustomed to a certain background of noise, the whisper of sand, the rustle of thorn, the distant calling of birds. That evening there was nothing. The quiet lay over us like a weight, so that when one of the camels snorted, the sound was startlingly loud. Old Yusuf sat very still by the fire, his eyes fixed on the dark. When I asked if he was unwell, he said only, "The sand is listening tonight." I took it for some local figure of speech and thought no more of it. The first unequivocal oddity occurred on the 9th day. We had altered course slightly to the southwest to reach a well marked on an older Italian map in my possession. The heat was severe, and we were all somewhat weakened. Around mid-morning, Ismail, who was walking ahead of the leading camel, stopped abruptly and raised his hand. We drew level with him and saw what had arrested him. Across our path, on the gentle slope of a dune, there ran a series of tracks. They were not the prints of any animal I knew. Each mark was an elongated oval, perhaps 8 inches in length, with a faint central ridge, as if something broad and smooth had pressed into the sand and then lifted cleanly. They were spaced at regular intervals, in a line that curved slightly, then descended the far side of the dune and disappeared. "What made those?" I asked, more sharply than I intended. The men conferred in Somali. At last Hersey said, "Not camel, not goat, perhaps a great snake." "There are no snakes of that size here," I said. "It is some distortion by the wind." Yet the prince had a clarity that belied that explanation. I measured one with my tape, noted the spacing, and sketched them. As I did so, a faint tremor ran through the sand under my knees, so slight that I might have imagined it. The camel nearest to me shifted and grumbled, showing its teeth. We followed the line of tracks for some distance, hoping to identify their source, but after perhaps 200 yards, they simply ceased upon a flat stretch of sand, as if the maker had vanished into the air. No drift of wind-blown sand obscured the last print. It was as crisp as the first. Beyond it, the desert lay undisturbed. Henderson frowned. "Some fellow is amusing himself with us," he said, though there was no conviction in his voice. "Who?" I asked. "There is no one." That night, the men spoke more quietly than usual. I heard the word kadab, repeated a term I had heard before, loosely translated to me as torment or spirit of affliction. When I pressed Hersey, he was reluctant to explain. "Old stories, Sahib," he said at last. "In some places, the sand is not empty. It remembers. It moves when men are not watching." "You mean sandstorms?" I said. "The wind shapes the dunes. That is all." He nodded, but his eyes were troubled. In the days that followed, our rational explanations grew more strained. We reached the Italian-marked well, only to find it choked with sand to a depth that made excavation impracticable with our tools. The wind there blew steadily from the east, yet the dune that had filled the well had a leeward slope in the same direction as the wind, a physical impossibility by the usual laws of drift. We were obliged to ration our water more strictly and press on to a more distant source. Tempers frayed. Henderson complained that the maps were worthless. The camel drivers muttered that we had strayed from the proper caravan ways. I did my best to maintain a tone of confidence, though in truth, my own certainty had begun to erode. It was around this time that the voices became unmistakable. One night, perhaps the 12th, I awoke to the sensation that someone stood just beyond the canvas of our small tent. I heard a low murmur, as of 2 or 3 men conversing in subdued tones, yet I could distinguish no words. The sound seemed to come not from a single point but from all around, as if the very ground whispered. I lay still, listening. The hair on my arms rose. Beside me, Henderson stirred. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. He was silent a moment. "It is the wind," he said at last, though there was a tremor in his voice. Yet there was no wind. The air outside was perfectly still. I could tell by the unflapping tautness of the tent walls. The murmuring continued for perhaps a minute, then faded, leaving an almost painful silence. In the morning, I asked the camel drivers if any of them had been about the camp during the night. They denied it. Old Yusuf looked at me with his one good eye and said, "You have begun to hear them. It is better not to listen." "Who?" I asked. He shrugged. "Those who were here before. Those who are under." There was no more to be had from him. By then, our rationality was under some strain. I told myself that the voices had been the blood in my own ears, that fatigue and heat had played tricks upon my senses. I wrote in my journal that night, "Auditory hallucination, likely due to exhaustion. Must watch for further such symptoms." I did not show this entry to Henderson. The microcosm of our little party reflected the growing disquiet. Henderson, who had begun the journey with a dry skepticism, now kept his rifle nearer to hand and slept fitfully. The younger camel drivers laughed too loudly at small jests and started at sudden noises. Only Farah seemed outwardly unshaken, though I sometimes saw him press his palm flat against the sand and then draw it back quickly, as if from something that burned or stung. It was on the 15th day that the desert revealed a more direct sign of its abnormality, and with a suddenness that shocked us from our weary routine. We were crossing a broad, gently rolling stretch of fine white sand under a sun so bright that the world seemed bleached of color. The camels plodded in their long, swaying gait. The only sounds were the creak of leather, the soft thud of padded feet, and the dry rasp of our own breathing. Without warning, the sand some 20 yards to our left rose in a narrow column, as if a small whirlwind had taken shape. Yet there was no wind. The column was perhaps 6 feet high and no more than a foot across, a twisting pillar of sand that turned upon itself with a faint, sighing noise. It held its shape unnaturally, not moving across the surface as a dust devil would, but remaining fixed to one spot. All motion in our caravan ceased. The camels balked, snorting. The men stared. The column shivered, then bent slightly toward us, like a snake tasting the air. For an instant, I can swear to this, I thought I discerned within it a darker, more solid core, as of something moving under the sand's veil. Then, with a sound like a long, drawn-out exhalation, it collapsed, and the desert lay smooth and undisturbed, save for our own prints. "By God," Henderson said hoarsely. Yusuf began to mutter a prayer. One of the younger men, Ali, made as if to turn his camel about. Farah caught his reins. "No," he said sharply. "If we run, it follows." "What do you mean?" I demanded. He hesitated, then said, "In some places, the desert does not like to be crossed. The old men say there are shapes in the sand that hear men's steps. If they take an interest, it is bad." "These are tales to frighten children," I said, but my voice lacked force. "We have seen a rare phenomenon of heated air. That is all." Farah looked at me with pity. "As you say, Sahib." From that point, our minds were no longer able to rest entirely upon rational grounds. We had entered the realm of cognitive dissonance, where what we had been taught of the world could not wholly contain what we observed. We continued, because there was no true alternative. To turn back would be to confess failure and risk our water running out before we reached the known wells behind us. To press on was equally uncertain, yet it had the illusion of purpose. The desert, for its part, seemed to take more notice of us. On several occasions, when we halted for the night, we found in the morning that the sand immediately around our bedrolls had been subtly rearranged, smoothed into shallow depressions that mirrored the curve of our bodies, as if some great hand had pressed down beside us. Once, Henderson awoke with his boots half buried, though there had been no wind in the night. Our camels grew increasingly restive after dark. They would stand with their heads raised, ears pricked, staring at nothing we could see. On one such night, I moved among them with a lantern, expecting to find a jackal or hyena lurking at the edge of the firelight. There was nothing. Yet, as I passed between two of the beasts, the ground beneath my right foot sank an inch, as if I had stepped onto a soft cushion. The sand there was no different in appearance from that around it, but it yielded and then firmed again, like flesh. I jerked my foot back, my heart hammering. When I prodded the spot with the butt of my rifle, it was as hard and unremarkable as any other patch. I said nothing of it to the others. Sleep, when it came, was thin and haunted by dreams of suffocation, of lying with my mouth full of dry, choking grains while something vast moved just below the surface. More than once I woke with my hand at my throat, certain that I had cried out, only to find the camp silent, save for the low grumble of a camel. I began, in those days, to entertain the reluctant notion that there was some agency in the desert beyond mere wind and heat. It was not a complete acceptance. A part of my mind still clung to the idea that we were witnessing unusual but ultimately explicable phenomena. Yet another part, older and less educated, whispered that we had trespassed upon ground that did not welcome us. The climax of our encounter came on the 18th night, though in truth, the days around it blur together in my recollection, as if time itself had grown unsteady. We had reached a region of particularly high dunes, their crests sharp against the sky. By my reckoning, we were not far from a line of seasonal wells used by caravans from Ogaden, though we had seen no other travelers for several days. Our water was low. The men were drawn and hollow-cheeked. We made camp in the lee of a great dune whose slope rose above us like the side of a ship. The evening was unnaturally still. Even the small insects that sometimes skittered across the sand were absent. The sunset bled out quickly, leaving a sky of cold stars and a crescent moon that hung low, its light turning the sand to a pale, bone-like hue. We ate little. The fire burned low. One by one, the men lay down, wrapping their thin blankets about them. Henderson and I retired to our tent. I lay for a long time, listening to the faint sounds of the camp, the occasional shift of a camel, a muffled cough. Then, quite suddenly, all such sounds ceased. It is difficult to convey the quality of that silence. It was not merely an absence of noise, but a presence, a thick, waiting stillness that pressed against the eardrums. I felt a pressure in my chest, as if the air had grown heavier. The hair on my arms and neck rose. Beside me, Henderson's breathing slowed, then stopped altogether. "Are you awake?" I whispered. "Yes," he breathed back. We lay thus for some moments. Then there came a faint rustle, like silk drawn over stone, from the slope of the dune above us. It was followed by another, closer, and then a subtle, almost imperceptible shifting beneath us, as if the ground were very slowly exhaling. I could bear it no longer. I reached for the lantern, lit it with shaking hands, and crawled out of the tent. Henderson followed. The camp lay bathed in a weak circle of yellow light. The camels were all on their knees, eyes rolling, foam at their mouths. Their ropes were slack. No man had bound them thus. "Yusuf?" I called softly. "Farah?" There was no answer. The bedrolls where the men had lain were half covered in a fine dusting of sand, as if some invisible hand had sifted it over them. My heart lurched. I rushed to the nearest, that of young Ali, and tore the blanket aside. It was empty. The depression in the sand where his body had been was deeper than it should have been, its sides strangely smooth, as if something had drawn him down. One by one, we checked the others. All 6 camel drivers were gone. In each place where a man had lain, the sand was slightly hollowed, the grains packed more tightly than the surrounding surface. There were no footprints leading away, no signs of struggle, no disturbance beyond those neat, unnatural hollows. "Dear God," Henderson whispered, "they cannot all have walked away without a sound." "They have not walked anywhere," I said, my mouth dry. "Look at the sand." The rustling from the dune grew louder, a soft, continuous susurration, like many voices whispering just beyond comprehension. The slope above us was no longer smooth. In the lantern light, we could see faint undulations running across it, as if something moved beneath the surface, pushing the sand upward in slow, sinuous waves. "We must go," Henderson said. "Now, to where?" I asked. But even as I spoke, I knew he was right. Whatever was in that dune, whatever had taken our men, would not be appeased by our paralysis. We moved to the camels, working by instinct. My hands shook so that I could scarcely untie the lead ropes. The beasts, usually docile, fought us, straining away from the dune, their whole bodies trembling. One let out a high, almost human scream that cut through the whispering. As we struggled, the rustling changed in character. It became more focused, more directed, as if the movement within the dune had oriented itself toward us. The sand at the base of the slope, not 10 yards away, began to bulge outward, forming a low, advancing ridge. The air grew markedly colder, so that my breath showed faintly in the lantern light, an impossibility in that climate. My teeth ached with it. Then we heard it. A single word, or something like a word, breathed out from the shifting sand. I cannot render it accurately in any language I know. It was a sound composed of many smaller sounds, as if 100 dry tongues had tried to form a syllable and failed. It carried a peculiar, intimate familiarity, as if it were attempting to shape our own names and could not quite manage them. The effect upon my nerves was profound. I felt as if my own thoughts were being echoed back to me from the ground. The ridge of sand advanced another foot, then another, its crest folding inward and rising, taking on, for an instant, a shape that suggested a great, eyeless head. I saw no solid form within it, nothing I could point to and call a body. It was sand, and yet it was not merely sand. It leaned toward us, the whispering intensifying, until I felt it in my bones. In that moment, all thought of understanding fled. My world contracted to the simple imperative of survival. I slashed at the nearest camel's rope, freeing it. Henderson did the same. We mounted without saddles, clinging to the beast's coarse hair. I seized the lantern and flung it behind us toward the advancing sand. It struck the ground and went out, but for an instant, its falling light showed something within the ridge, a darker, denser shadow that recoiled from the flame. "Go," I shouted, driving my heels into the camel's flanks. The animals needed no urging. They lurched to their feet and plunged away from the dune, sand spraying from their hooves. Behind us, the whispering rose to a hiss, then to a sound like a vast intake of breath. The ground quivered beneath the camel's strides, as if something immense had shifted its weight. For a terrible instant, I thought we would be dragged down, swallowed like our men. But the tremor lessened as we gained distance. We did not stop for a long time. The desert ahead was a blur of pale shapes under the stars. My hands were numb on the camel's neck. My throat burned with cold air and fear. When at last we dared to look back, the great dune where we had camped was a darker mound against the sky, featureless. The whispering had ceased. There was no sign of our companions. We rode on through the night, guiding the camels by the stars and by a kind of animal instinct, for our instruments were useless in that state. When the first grey of dawn touched the eastern horizon, we halted briefly to water the camels and wet our own mouths. Henderson's face was drawn, his eyes bloodshot. "Did we truly see it?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Or have we gone mad together?" "We saw something," I said. "Whether it accords with sanity, I do not know." We spoke little after that. There was a tacit agreement between us not to name what we had witnessed, as if to do so would grant it greater reality. Our world had narrowed to the practical business of escape. We had lost 6 men, most of our supplies, and a portion of our water in our haste. The 2 camels we had managed to bring carried only a fraction of what we had set out with. The journey back to Berbera was a study in slow disintegration. By day, the sun beat upon us with an almost vindictive force. Our lips cracked and bled. The skin on our hands blistered and peeled. We rationed the remaining water with a severity that would have seemed inhuman under other circumstances. At night, we dared not camp near any large dunes. We chose instead the flattest, most exposed stretches we could find and lay down, without tents, our rifles within reach. The desert did not pursue us in the overt manner of that night, but it did not release us entirely. On several occasions, as we lay awake in the dark, we felt faint tremors in the ground, as of something moving at a great depth. Once, a low, distant whisper reached us, carried on no wind, from a direction we could not determine. It seemed to circle us, then fade. The camels would raise their heads, ears twitching, then settle again, as if whatever moved beneath the sand had decided to let us pass. We did not speak of it. We conserved our breath for walking and for the small, necessary exchanges of navigation. When we did talk, it was of mundane things: the taste of beer in a London public house, the feel of rain on one's face, the sound of a piano through an open window. We clung to such images as to lifelines. Once, in the cooler hours before dawn, as we trudged side by side, Henderson said quietly, "Do you think they suffered?" I knew whom he meant. I saw again the smooth hollows in the sand where our men had lain. "I do not know," I said. "I hope not." "I keep thinking," he went on, "of Farah's story of his boys. He said the younger liked to ride on his shoulders. I find I cannot reconcile that with the way he went." "There is nothing to reconcile," I said, more sharply than I intended. "We cannot know what happened beneath the sand. We can only go on." He fell silent. I regretted my tone, but I had no words to mend it. On the 23rd day from Berbera, we sighted the low, dark line of the coastal hills. My heart, which had grown used to disappointment, dared to quicken. As we descended from the high, open haud toward more familiar ground, the signs of life returned. Thorn scrub, bird calls, the distant bleating of goats. The desert's peculiar silence loosened its grip. When at last we saw the white buildings of Berbera and the masts of ships in the harbor, I felt an almost dizzying disjunction between the ordered, human world before us and the vast, indifferent emptiness behind. Men moved about their business. Children ran, shouting, between the houses. The smell of fish and wood smoke lay on the air. It might have been another planet. We were taken at once to the residency, where the local British official, a Mr. Carstairs, received us with a mixture of irritation and concern. We must have presented a sorry sight. Burned, ragged, hollow-eyed, with only 2 of our original 10 camels, and without the 6 Somali men who had set out with us. "What in heaven's name happened to you?" he demanded. After the first courtesies. "Bad water, lost wells, a sandstorm," I said. The words came out automatically, as if I had rehearsed them. In a sense, I had. During those long, silent days, we were compelled to turn back. "And the camel boys?" "Lost in the storm," I said. Henderson's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Carstairs frowned. "We have had no reports of storms of that magnitude." "It was very local," I said. "The desert is capricious." He harumphed, made some remark about the unreliability of native labor, and sent for a doctor to see to our condition. There was no further pressing of the matter that day. In the weeks that followed, as we recovered in Berbera, the question of our official report loomed. The Royal Geographical Society would expect an account of our journey, our observations, and an explanation for our failure to complete the survey. Henderson and I conferred in the shade of a corrugated iron veranda, the sea glittering beyond. "We cannot write what we saw," he said. "They would think us mad or liars." "They might," I said, "or they might dismiss it as exaggeration or a native tale repeated without due skepticism. In any case, it would do no good to the families of the men we lost." He stared out at the harbor. "Do we owe them the truth?" "What truth?" I asked. "That the sand moved in ways it should not? That a dune took an interest in us? That something beneath the desert whispered our names? These are not truths that can be weighed or measured. They would only bring ridicule upon their memories." In the end, we agreed upon a compromise that satisfied neither our consciences nor our sense of reality. The official report, which I submitted to the Society upon my return to London, spoke of unexpected aeolian phenomena, of disorienting mirage effects, and of a violent, localized sandstorm in which 6 of our Somali assistants were unfortunately separated from the main party and presumed lost. I described the curious tracks and the column of sand in cautious, speculative terms, suggesting that they might represent unusual manifestations of wind vortices in regions of extreme aridity. The society received the report with polite interest. At a meeting some months later, a fellow I knew only slightly, a meteorologist of some repute, delivered a short paper expanding upon my observations, proposing that certain resonant frequencies of wind over homogeneous sand surfaces might produce the so-called singing sands reported in various deserts, and that my experiences were likely an example of such. There was some discussion, a few questions, and then the meeting moved on to matters of glaciology in the Alps. No one, so far as I know, lost sleep over my brief mention of unsettling sounds in the Somali interior. The names of the men we lost were not recorded in any minutes. They remained, in the eyes of the learned, anonymous native assistants, regrettable but unremarkable casualties of exploration. Privately, the matter was less easily dismissed. Henderson and I exchanged several letters in the years immediately following our return, but we seldom spoke directly of that night. Once, in response to some innocuous remark of mine about a lecture I had attended, he wrote, "I find now that I cannot listen to men speak with such certainty about the world. They draw their maps and write their equations as if the earth were a tame thing, fully knowable. I wonder what they would say if they had lain on that sand." He emigrated to Canada not long after, took up some minor post in a survey office there. Our correspondence dwindled. The last I heard of him, years later, was a brief notice in a society newsletter recording his death from pneumonia. As for myself, the desert followed me home. In London, on damp autumn evenings, I would sit by my fire and hear, beneath the crackle of coal, a faint, dry susurration. In the quiet hours before dawn, the sound of a passing carriage in the street below sometimes mimicked with uncanny precision the low, shifting rustle of sand moving in great quantities. On one such night, I woke with the absolute conviction that something lay just beneath the floorboards under my bed. Listening, I threw back the covers, lit the lamp, and knelt, pressing my ear to the boards like a man listening for burglars. Of course, there was nothing. The rational part of my mind told me that I had merely dreamed, that my heart's pounding was the only sound I heard. Yet, as I lay back down, I could not quite shake the sensation of having been overheard. Some years after the expedition, I attended a small gathering at the Society where a young ethnographer presented a paper on Somali folklore. Among the tales he recounted, almost in passing, was that of the whispering sands of the Haoud. According to his notes, certain clans avoided particular stretches of desert, saying that the ground there was hungry and that those who slept upon it might be taken without trace. He chuckled as he related this, inviting his audience to share in his amusement at such superstition. I did not laugh. I found that my hand, resting on the arm of my chair, had closed into a fist so tight that my nails dug into my palm. Afterward, I approached him and asked as casually as I could whether he had ever traveled to those regions himself. "No," he said. "The stories are from interpreters and traders in Berbera. I doubt there is much to them. The desert is always a convenient place to set one's ghosts." I made some non-committal reply and left early. That night, sleep would not come. I lay in the darkness of my London room and felt again the cold press of that Somali air against my teeth, the unnatural stillness, the way the sand had seemed to lean nearer. On another occasion, perhaps a decade after our return, I was walking along the embankment when I heard behind me a soft, sliding sound, like a foot dragging through loose grains. It was entirely out of place on that paved London thoroughfare. I turned sharply. There was only a man in a bowler hat hurrying past, his shoes clacking on the stones. The sound had been an illusion, a momentary trick of perception, yet it left me standing there, absurdly, with my heart racing, as omnibuses and cabs rattled by. I have made attempts, over the years, to rationalize what we experienced. I have read every paper I could find on desert acoustics, on the phenomenon of booming dunes reported in the Sahara and Gobi, on the peculiar behavior of granular materials under certain conditions. Some of these studies are fascinating. They explain how sand can, under the right circumstances, produce sounds like organs or distant thunder. None of them account for the feeling of intent, of attention, that I perceived that night in the Haud. For a time, I entertained the notion that we had been the victims of some elaborate human agency, that men, unseen in the dark, had stolen our companions, that the movements in the sand had been some trick, but there were no tracks, no signs of intrusion, and no motive that I can conceive that would justify such an effort in that remote and inhospitable place. The simplicity of the erasure, the neat hollows where men had been, resists such explanations. Ultimately, I have come to a kind of uneasy truce with my ignorance. There are things in this world, and perhaps in the ground beneath it, that do not fit comfortably within our schemes. Men of science, of which I count myself one in a modest way, are loath to admit this. We prefer to believe that with sufficient data, sufficient measurement, all will yield. The desert taught me otherwise. What haunts me most is not the sight of the moving sand, nor even the absence where 6 men had been. It is a smaller, more intimate detail. On that final night, as we fled, there was a moment when the advancing ridge of sand seemed to hesitate, to draw back from the lantern's fall. In that instant, the whispering rose in pitch, and for the briefest fraction of time, I thought I heard within it a single, clear syllable, not my name, nor Henderson's, but a word in no tongue I know, filled with a kind of frustrated curiosity. It is that sense of being noticed, of having attracted the attention of something vast and patient, and not entirely mindless, that lingers. When I walk now upon any beach, feeling the give of wet sand under my shoes, I am conscious of what lies beneath that thin crust. Countless grains, shifting, waiting. At night, when the house is quiet, I sometimes fancy I hear, under the ordinary creaks and sighs of timber and plaster, a faint, dry murmur, as of something turning in its sleep far below. I tell myself that it is nothing, that it is only the memory of a younger man's terror. For the most part, this suffices. I live, I read, I attend lectures, I make my small contributions to the orderly accumulation of knowledge. Yet there are moments rare, but decisive, when a certain silence falls, when even the city holds its breath, and I am transported back to that dune under the Somali stars. In those moments, I remember the feel of the sand yielding under my boot like flesh, the camels sinking to their knees without command, the sudden cold in my mouth as if the air itself had curdled. I remember the way the dune's crest folded inward, as if drawing breath, and I find myself wondering, not whether it was real, but whether, somewhere in that wide, empty Haud, under some unremarkable mound of sand, something still waits, listening for the tread of men who have not yet learned to walk softly.